Well, yes. But it's the last day of freedom and abandonment. Now you have 40 days starting tomorrow, with the exception of Sundays, when you're going to be fasting. Sundays are feast days, you know that. But 40 days of preparation, and so enjoy the day. And part of the enjoyment is being here. Look at the title behind me. An insightful, wondering kind of response on my part. It has been 160 years since the end of the Civil War. 160 years. If a generation is 40 years, that's 4 generations. Only 4 generations since. And the question is always, the war was the cause, but what is the effect? And that's part of the thinking of this day. Dr. Martinez, as always, thrilled to have you back.
Thank you. I was saying on the way in, my Pennsylvania Dutch ancestors, I think, were a little too strict to have a huge party for Fat Tuesday, but we did have donuts. And I didn't get a donut this morning, it just felt very wrong. So, it's Fastnacht Day where I grew up. Our topic for today is women on the Confederate home front, and there were a lot of questions about that last week, so I'm hoping I'm picking up on some of those questions. And I want to set the scene by starting prior to the war with just some ideas about what women were supposed to be like, which doesn't necessarily mean what they were like, but what the ideal woman was in mid-19th century United States. And this is very much a sort of middle class, upper middle class, but also sort of wealthy plantation family, wealthy industrialist family sort of vision, right? And a big part of it is what historians have termed separate spheres, or the ideology of domesticity. That the world is broken up into 2 areas. There is the private sphere, the home, which is the place of family, and it is a refuge from the public sphere. The public sphere is the world outside the home. It's the world of making money. It's the world of politics. It's the world of things that can corrupt you, and the home is a refuge from those things. Right? That's the ideal. And of course, in this splitting of the world, the public sphere is the world of men, and the private sphere is the world of women. What type of woman? Well, the cult of true womanhood tells us that the ideal early Victorian, early industrial revolution, right? We're seeing like the rise of urban areas and these sort of divisions of labor where there is a separation. Part of this is really predicated on a separation between home and workplace that, first of all, doesn't count if you live on a farm, right? Which still the majority of Americans do in 1860. Right? If you live on a farm, your home and your workplace are not separate. Right? But prior to the early Industrial Revolution, most people in towns and cities and people who were artisans and shopkeepers also did not separate their home from their workplace. Those things were the same building. You lived above or next to the place where you earned your living, and so everyone was involved. Right? And what happens in the 1820s is these things start to separate, and you get residential parts of towns and commercial parts of towns. And so middle-class families emerge as these people who have the separate sphere. Right? And then farm families will sort of try to emulate some of that lifestyle. Right? If you can afford to keep your daughters from working in the fields, for example, right? That's a status symbol, and that's a way of having part of the middle class lifestyle. So the ideal doesn't hold, of fully separate spheres doesn't hold true for the vast majority of people, but this is like what everyone's striving to live like. And if you open a magazine, this is what the family is supposed to look like. If you read a sermon that talks about the family, it sort of upholds this idea of separation between workplace and home. And the home is the place ruled by women, right, by the perfect wife who is, these 4 words over and over again, domestic, she stays in the home. She rules the home, but she stays in the home. Pious, she is in charge of the family's faith life. Right? Submissive, right? So she has a certain moral authority that comes from her superior piety and from the fact that she's not corrupted by the world outside the home, but she still submits to her husband. Right? And she is pure. Right? And by this, they typically mean sexually pure. Right? Women in this ideal of domesticity want to become mothers, but beyond that, they are not interested in marital relations. All of this gives wives in this world a certain authority within the home, right? Particularly when it comes to raising children. Right? So in the colonial era, you would have seen father as head of the household being taken seriously and to the letter in every way. And that includes decisions about what to do with children and how to raise children and how to discipline them. And the transition of the early 19th century gives us this idea that no, mothers, particularly for young children, should have the final say in how they're being raised and how they're being taught and how they're being disciplined. And you raise a good child through love and moral persuasion and perhaps a healthy dose of guilt rather than by hitting them, right? So we're seeing corporal punishment go out of fashion with this set, and a different idea, right, of family life being organized around kind of 2 spheres of power. And dad makes decisions about, things that live in the outside sphere. In the outside world, dad makes decisions about money and if we're going to move and if people are taking jobs and has maybe more of a say over where sons go to school as they get older. Right? But mother has more authority over the things of the home. Okay? All of this is certainly racially specific, but also class specific. Right? Middle class and upper class married white women get all of this authority and purity because women who are of other descriptions, whether they are working class white women or women of color, are first of all available to men, right? So your wife shouldn't have to endure you in her bedroom, and wives are allowed to say no under this new system, right? But you can do what you want with other types of women. But also, there are all of these working women in the middle class home and the upper class home, right? So middle class and upper class wives get to step away from a lot of the hard labor of managing a home because there are other women who are doing that work, right? Enslaved women in many places, but also wage-earning women. Right? And so the home is a workplace for a lot of women. Right? The work that middle class and upper class wives do, right, which historians call reproductive labor, the work of caring for having the family, but also caring for the family. Having children, raising children, making sure they're fed, making sure they're clothed, doing the mending and the canning and the preserving. I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into food maintenance that even wives, get sort of typical middle class and even sort of lower plantation class women in the South would have done some of that. Wives would have done some of that work. They would have been doing it maybe with assistance from servants or slaves, but they would have been doing some of that work, and yet describe themselves in a letter as having done no work. You'll see these letters they write to their friends. Well, I got up today and I helped wash the windows and I rearranged all the furniture in the living room, and so we dusted everything and we beat the carpets and I helped with some canning, and I don't know why I'm tired. I haven't done anything all day today, right? There's a lot of work that goes into maintaining a home in this early industrial era, but it's been redefined as not work if it's done by the wife and the mother. Right? Even though there are often a lot of paid people around doing that work or enslaved people around doing that work. Right? So the home is never fully separate from the marketplace, right? And it is also never quite a place where all women have moral authority. It really depends on your status. Right? And then we get to the idea of the plantation mistress, right, who in many versions of the antebellum story, particularly the kind of hazy memory versions of it, is described as often the velvet glove over the iron fist, right? So the slaveholder is the authority figure, and his wife is the one who makes sure everyone's fed and clothed and taken care of, and softens the system in some way. Right? But the historians who've actually studied what plantation wives do on a day-to-day basis, and particularly the significant role they played in maintaining one location while their husband was visiting another location, because a lot of these families had multiple areas being farmed at a time, right, is that they were both the iron fist and the velvet glove. They had to be both. And so there are a lot of women who have genuine authority over what's being done on the plantation. Even if they're not the ones executing the orders day to day, they are the ones helping give the orders, or in many cases giving the orders, always on behalf of their husband, but oftentimes in his absence. Sure. It could. Right? So if you were a wealthy widow, widowhood could be very empowering. Right? If you were a wealthy widow who had a son who was not yet of maturity, old enough to take over, you could be the one keeping things going and have a lot of power. Or if you were a wealthy enough family that in your marriage settlement, when you went into the marriage, you brought property, and the contract set up indicated that you would get that property when your husband died. Right? Or a wealthy widow whose husband had set aside a significant portion for her in the will, you could do very well. Widowhood could also be a source of great poverty. Because under the law, the widow is typically entitled to a third of the property under her control until all children have reached the age of majority. Right? So you could be really out of luck. If you're from a poor household and you don't have a way to make anything happen for yourself. Right? So it could really vary. But certainly there's plenty of widows who keep the plantations going, right, for long periods of time, or they marry again. You can marry well. You can perhaps marry up if you get some property out of the marriage settlement or out of the will that you can take with you into the next marriage. You can potentially move up the social ladder as a widow. So yeah, women are both less empowered, less submissive than this statement would suggest, less tied to the domestic sphere, particularly in the South when it comes to things like missionary societies and other sort of church activities that women are in charge of, Sunday schools, things like that women take responsibility for. They're forming corporations and organizations and fundraising and writing letters and creating newsletters and magazines. They're doing all of this work in the context of something that is still seen as appropriate for women because it's about the church, right? But they are, in fact, running their own organizations outside of the home. Right? Women in the South are also heavily involved in temperance work. Right? So there's this movement starting to suggest that maybe people should drink less alcohol. Sometimes it's outright prohibition, but more often, especially in the South, it's just sort of moderation. And that is also seen as a really appropriate activity for women of this sort of separate spheres position to be involved in, right? So it's outside of the home. It's taking a stand on something in the outside world, but it affects the home, it affects the family, and that's how they present it, right? Outside of the South, you'll also see women getting involved in abolitionism, in the early women's rights movement, right? And so what they do often is take the logic of separate spheres and apply it to the outside sphere, and say, if women have this moral authority, shouldn't we be listened to? Right? And if women are responsible for our families and our children, sometimes we need to go outside of the home in order to take care of our families and children. Right? When it comes to schools and safe streets and safe communities, right, it is my responsibility as a mother to get involved in the public sphere. So that's how they often frame it. And then we'll see women like Louisa May Alcott, who did not have children of her own, say, okay, I'm not a mother, but I'm an aunt, I'm a member of a family, and I am concerned about the same things that mothers are, and therefore I have the same right to speak out. One thing I always am trying to keep in the back of my head here, when we think about the antebellum model, right, when we think about where do enslaved women fit into this, right, well, by definition, they are not part of the domestic sphere, even if they work in the home. Right? They are not part of the cult of true womanhood because they are not middle class and upper class white wives. They don't have the same status. Right? They are, of course, expected to work in a variety of ways, right? And they are expected to be sexually available in ways that allow white women to then maintain their purity. Okay? And there's just this general hierarchy that scholars have often referred to as paternalism, right, of the plantation household, of everyone has a space and a role and obligations both up and down in that hierarchy and in that system, and that includes how the women of the planter class and the women of the enslaved classes work together, sometimes side by side, right? Sometimes doing the same work, but with different status and different expectations and different ways of understanding the work they are doing. Right? Whether it's caring for your family, right, or caring for somebody else's family who you may have friendly feelings toward, but they're still not your children. Right? And so it's a different sort of experience. All right, so jumping into the war itself. But I wanted to set the scene. I took longer than I thought setting the scene. I apologize. The war obviously is going to present a lot of challenges to this model. And I'm not going to go through these like in exact order. These are just all the things that I'm thinking about as we think about what the war means. Okay? And part of the understanding here is that when these things affect you varies. Where you live in the South shapes how much the war affects you, particularly early in the war. The longer the war goes on, the more it affects everyone, particularly the shortages. Right? The shortages in labor, the shortages in food, the shortages of supplies as the blockade gets ever tighter. It was basically a giant sieve at the beginning of the war, but eventually it does become effective, right? So the blockade is trapping you, you can't get supplies or they're very expensive. The things that were working in 1861 have broken, and as we said, there are some things that the South simply does not have the capacity to manufacture because they were importing it. Right? Things like the combs that you use to card the wool and the flax, right? Southern women had, for the most part, by the 1850s, stopped making cloth. Right? It was not economically efficient. Pre-made cloth was so cheap by 1850, right? And meanwhile, the price of cash crops was going up. Right? So you wouldn't waste labor making cloth. You put every available hand you have to grow the cotton or the tobacco or the rice or whatever it is, your wheat, whatever it is you're making your money off of. Right? And on a small farm as well, right, there are times when it is all hands on deck on that farm. Right? Harvest, planting, everyone is helping. And then there are other times when maybe women are doing other things. Right? But still, you're better off growing the cash crop and selling it for the highest possible profit and then buying your supplies. So there weren't a whole lot of women who had much experience by 1861 of making cloth. It was a dying art or a dead art for at least the last 10 years. and they had to drag out the old cards where through these like wiry combs to smooth the cotton and wool fibers to try to make homespun. And when those wiry combs broke, you had no way of replacing them. So there's just that it's getting harder and harder to find the things you need to make do when your purchased supplies are no longer available. Right? So early on, it doesn't have a lot of impact, but the longer the war goes, the harder it gets. And then also, a lot of the hardships are due to the presence of armies, which could be a hardship, could be a benefit, depends. And that also, whether it's a friendly army or an occupying army, could be a hardship, could be a benefit. Right? And whether you see them as friendly or occupying depends on your perspective as well. Right? But for most sort of Confederate women, even while they would have initially welcomed the presence of Confederate forces nearby, right, seeing them as protection, right, seeing the possibility that, hey, maybe my husband is going to be one of those ones stationed nearby, so I get to see him more often, or my son, or whoever it is I've sent off to war. The army nearby is still taking up resources. They are coming to your house for supplies. They're borrowing your slaves. They're borrowing your wagons. They're taking your horses, your firewood. Even if you support them, this can be really frustrating and scary, right? They're taking up all the available food in your neighborhood the longer they are there. There's also deserters. Right? So when the army comes through, the men who, and then they leave, some of those men stay behind. They don't want to be in the army anymore. And North Carolina has really high rates of enlistment, but also really high rates of desertion. Right? And particularly every time there is a kind of a big sweep for the draft, right? It's conscription in North Carolina. Men get rounded up, they're brought in, they fill out their forms, they sign their names, they're enlisted, and about a quarter of them leave at the first possible opportunity and try to go home. Right? But also as the army moves, there's stragglers, there's deserters, there's wounded they leave behind deliberately. So an army's presence in your community can linger for a long time. And some of those people are a threat. Whether they're intentionally a threat, some of them are, some of the stragglers and deserters are going to come into your house at night and steal whatever supplies they need as they move on. Right? And some of them are perhaps not intending to be a threat, but they're still using resources. And of course, if you're being occupied, again, if you're a Confederate woman and the Union sets up for a long time in your area, like New Bern, and I always forget, North Carolina, is it Beaufort or Beaufort? It's Beaufort in North Carolina and Beaufort in South Carolina? Okay. So if you're in Carteret County, we could say that. But if you're in New Bern, Beaufort, if you're on Roanoke Island, and you have a long-term occupying Union army from late 1862 onward, right? How do you adjust to that? How do you deal with it? There's a significant portion of the white communities of those towns who leave, right? And so we have the refugee experience. Right? There's also people who stay, who perhaps take a loyalty oath so they can get a job with the army that's occupying them, or they can get supplies from the army that's occupying them, or they can get the assistance of the Union Army to prevent their slaves from running away. Because under U.S. law, the slaves of loyal masters, loyal to the Union, are supposed to stay where they are, and it's only the slaves of disloyal masters who can become free. Right? That's again, late 1862, early 1863. So we see a lot of people in Carteret County, for example, in particular, take the loyalty oath and try to take advantage of the situation. And in fact, the first Confederate unit stationed at the first local unit stationed at Fort Macon was a Union unit, not a Confederate unit. So there are decisions to be made when an army comes through and stays for a while, right? In terms of how you make the best of it, which side do you support, right? And we do see that difference in, Carteret County, for the most part, the white population staying and making nice with the occupying force, at least initially. And in Craven County and in New Bern, a lot of the white population fled and went to the mountains. Right? So then we all get this shift in a place like Western North Carolina, which had not been particularly vocal or well known for its support of the Confederacy early on. Right? They eventually they voted for secession in May 1861. They sent troops, but they were not nearly as invested as the coast had been in this project of a new nation. And all of a sudden there are these big plantation holders from Craven County showing up in the mountains and really changing the social dynamic and the economic dynamic. The enslaved population of Western North Carolina actually went up over the course of the war as the refugees arrived and brought their slaves with them. So if you're a refugee of means, you can come in and establish yourself and hire out your slaves to the local community who've sent their husbands off to war, so they're eager to find a laborer, right, a farm laborer of some sort. But you can also, have trouble making friends, getting set up. You can be seen as an outsider, an interloper, someone who's taking up scarce resources. And if you're a poor person becoming a refugee and you've left behind anything of value, there's a particular struggle to that. So the refugee experience, as everything else we're describing, looks really different depending on your status. But it's not a super common experience in North Carolina compared to other parts of the Confederacy, but for those coastal communities, it's not uncommon, right? Again, and what we see left behind on Roanoke Island and also in New Bern is a portion of the planter class refugees, and they used it as a verb at the time. They're refugee without their slaves, and they leave their slaves behind. Right? And we see free people's communities set up in these places, and then runaway slaves joining them. Right? So once word gets out that the Union Army is encamped anywhere for a significant period of time, enslaved people begin making their way to them. And so we get some early units formed in New Bern, U.S. colored troops units, with runaways from as far away as Union County, all the way down here in the outskirts of Charlotte. I totally lost my train of thought. What was I going to say? We also see the wives and the children of those men who join those Union units setting up kind of refugee camps in and around all of these Union Army installations. And then you start hearing from the slaveholding class, all of my slaves have gone. Usually not all. But you wake up, if you have 20 slaves and you wake up and 2 of them are gone, you're going to notice that. Right? And so we'll start also seeing in the letters that slaveholders send to the governor complaining about the impressment quotas that I talked about last week. One of the things that come up for them is, some of my Negroes have left. They've gone to the Union Army. Or as a group in the Shenandoah Valley described in a letter to the governor of Virginia, slavery has become a volunteer state. Someone can run away at dusk and be in a Union Army camp by dawn, and everyone knows it. So we have to negotiate now with our own slaves to get them to stay. So the process of being a slaveholder became more and more complicated, and for many families, it's the women who are the ones left behind doing this. Right? And so if you were someone whose understanding of your role as a slaveholder's wife is, I hand out the cloth and the food rations, and I work with the house servants, and my husband handles the field servants, you're now expected to make sure those people keep working and handle negotiations with them over the fact that they want more freedom to go visit their wives and children on the next plantation. And if you don't give it to them, they might just leave, and then you're really in trouble. So slaveholding shifts, what it looks like on a day-to-day basis shifts. The reality of that labor shortage affects small farms as well. Even if you don't have enslaved labor on your farm, or you have maybe short-term hired labor from time to time, right, a lot of the work of managing a farm cannot be done by one adult. Right? So there are wives who are going to be involved in farm work, whether it's part of the official definition of their world or not. Right? Again, planting, harvest, everyone who can work works. If you think about slaughtering a pig or a cow, these are all-day affairs that involve a lot of people to cut and preserve and prepare all of that meat. So you just need a certain number of able-bodied adults and teenagers to get things done. And when you pull half of those people out, you have a problem. Even if wives had been doing some of that work beforehand, they're not accustomed to or prepared to do it all on their own. So it's just harder to keep the supplies of the home front going. And then you have all of these people coming and taking your supplies. Right? The occupying army is going to take some of your supplies. They'll at least pay you for them, typically. You might also, if there's an occupying army, have access to supplies you didn't, because they might be able to bring some in. Right? So some people take the loyalty oath to be able to trade with or buy from the union quartermasters and suppliers. Right? The friendly army is also taking your stuff. They may or may not pay you for it. If they do pay you for it, they're paying you for it in currency that is rapidly losing anything resembling value. As we get to the end of the war, we have, depending on which version of the inflation chart you look at, anywhere between 900 and 9,000% inflation in the Confederacy. Plus there's all of this like state-issued paper money that muddies the waters and is even less valuable. But also those deserters are taking your things. And then the Home Guard in North Carolina is coming through looking for the deserters. And they have strict orders to gather up the deserters from the Confederate Army and bring them back, to gather up the runaways from the Union Army or from the prisons, right? The prison down in Florence is not particularly secure. And if people are trying to get away from it, they're going to come through North Carolina on their way, trying to make it back to Ohio, most likely. Sorry. It goes to sleep if I don't touch it for 15 minutes. It's very needy. So there's just all of these people constantly tramping their way through, making demands on your ever-dwindling supply of resources, and the Home Guard is looking for them. Right? So very often, these women are not entirely innocent in this process. Their husband or son has deserted from the Confederate Army. He's hiding out in the swamp or the woods not too far away. Neighbors notice that all of a sudden the farm is looking better tended than it used to because somebody's coming by at night and doing some of the work, bringing them maybe things they've killed in the forest, handing over some other food supplies. These deserter bands, and I've told the story of Henry Berry Lowry here before. He's not unusual. There are bands of deserters in every swamp, right? In every forested area. Think of like the Uwaris and the amount of space you would have there to hide in these huge swaths of largely unoccupied and sort of unfarmed land. Right? There's bands of deserters all over the place. And they're coming home to help out when they can. They're also stealing food from people they see as having enough. Right? So if you are someone who supports the Confederacy and maybe of the planter class in a community where there's deserters nearby, they're coming and stealing your food, and then they're taking it to their wives. Right? And that is going on everywhere, and everyone knows it. Right? And so the Home Guard in North Carolina has been told, North Carolina is getting a reputation for having the highest percentage of deserters, right? And for all of this deserter activity going on. So your job is to round up the deserters and you do whatever it takes to complete your mission. They have orders, to take an overwhelming force so that people are less likely to resist. But if they do, and someone is killed in the doing of your duty, oh well, that's too bad, but it's okay, you're not responsible. So the Home Guard is a state force that answers to the state adjutant general. So it's like a new branch of the state militia. And the militia's been called up to join the Confederate Army. The Home Guard is going to now take their place, and they are essentially the local police force, but a state police force that's primarily acting on behalf of the Confederacy when it comes to gathering up deserters in particular. And so, when I had told the Henry Berry Lowry story, they talked about the fact that his elderly father and mother seemed to have a lot of guns and supplies on their farm that it wasn't clear they had obtained legally. Everyone suspected that Henry and his brothers and brothers-in-law were out there in the swamp. Right? And you couldn't catch Henry, so instead you got his father and his young nephew and you executed them. Right? This is not exclusively happening to Native people in Robeson County. It's happening particularly to religious dissenters' families, but other deserters' families as well. So there's a story out of northern Moore County, the Carthage area, of a Wesleyan Methodist minister and his family. His two sons were drafted, deserted, came home, were arrested for desertion, taken to Raleigh. The sisters tried to get them back from the Home Guard and actually, brandished their guns on the Home Guard. The Home Guard smacked them around a little bit, but didn't kill them, notably. And the brothers were taken to Raleigh and executed for desertion. Right? And the sisters wrote a number of letters to the governor trying to get clemency. Right? So the process looks a little different for white men. Right? They're not just shot on their farm. They are taken away and executed under sort of more official means, but the result is the same. And so we have these stories from the wives and daughters of and mothers of deserters talking about being abused by the Home Guard when the Home Guard comes through looking for their men. Right? And often it's happening with women who are seen as being, at least on the outskirts of loyalty. Right? They're not fully loyal to the Confederacy. Obviously they're not, or their husbands would have stayed in the Army. Right? But often it is some sort of question of, are they really Unionists? Right? Are they full-on dissenters and pacifists? We see often, right? They're not loyal to the Confederacy. That's certainly the case. And that's actually, I was gonna have all these ideas that I try to put in a neat list do not come out in a neat list. They are very intertwined. What we see increasingly as the war progresses is women making demands on the government that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Right? Most notably, in the spring of this didn't fit anywhere in any of the sort of, but it's important. Right? There are women who get jobs for the first time because of this war. Right? And that happens in every war. Sort of the middle class type women going into the wage workforce for at least a period of time. So there are a lot of jobs that in sort of Confederate War Department that become available for people with nice handwriting, right? Because they literally hand sign every single one of those rapidly deflating paper bills, right? But also as able-bodied men are pulled out of clerkships, some women move into those positions. If you're educated and you have decent handwriting, you can be a good clerk. This is also the time period where nursing becomes seen as a respectable profession for women. Right? Before the Civil War, the only people who died in hospitals were the people who didn't have family to take care of them. Right? So the hospital was a place for the very, very indigent or for people who were on the outskirts of society, and not an appropriate place for a nice middle-class lady, certainly. The war changes that, and people have to very quickly shift their definition of what a hospital is when it becomes their own sons dying in one. and the idea that a hospital should be made as home-like as possible, and that there should be a motherly person there to care for the dying, becomes very important very quickly. Right? And we see women like Phoebe Yates Pember, who gets put in charge of the Confederate matron service. The matrons are these female nurses who are coming in and sitting in the wards, and some of them are doing very active nursing work and very, sort of intensive training involved in that, and others are writing letters and making people more comfortable because that's all they can do. Right? There's a full range of what these female nurses might do in terms of the skill level and the training level involved. I couldn't do any of it, I can tell you that much. There's a lot of emphasis on respectability, so married women are preferred. If you're single, you should be older and not attractive. Right? This is not a place for husband hunting, and they want to make that very clear from the beginning. Right? They are not setting up, a matchmaking service through this nursing profession. Right? There are also a lot of enslaved women doing kind of the harder work of nursing in the South, so they'll keeping the laundry clean and the wards clean, and also there are certainly the women who kind of come through with soup and comforting things and to write the letters in a more sort of genteel nursing fashion and bring their slaves with them, although that also just becomes less common as the war progresses because nursing becomes professionalized. Right? So there are these new professions that open up for women that are seen as respectable out of necessity that people continue doing after the war. But also we see in the spring of 1863, some women who are actually working for the Confederate government in the Treasury House, signing the bills, in some of the factories in Richmond, as well as the women who operate the small markets that surround the city. Right? Come into Richmond demanding not so much food as access to the government's cloth supplies, because they cannot get cloth for clothing. Right? And they start breaking the windows and taking supplies. There are also smaller bread riots in at least 4 small cities in North Carolina, where the women, again, are kind of focused on Confederate storehouses that have supplies that they are not able to get. Right? It's notable that all of this is happening mid to late spring, right, when your supplies from the fall are starting to dwindle, but the spring things haven't come in yet. In Richmond, the women, hundreds of them, make their way to Jefferson Davis's house, the White House of the Confederacy, and demand that he come out and help them. And instead he came out and had soldiers ring the square and tell them they had 5 minutes to disperse or they would be shot. It's unclear that any of the men would have actually fired on them. There's a lot of uproar amongst the men who were asked to do this, that this is not what they signed up for the army to do. There's a lot of sympathy for these women, but there also are trials. Right? And what's interesting is if you look at the trials in Richmond of the women involved in the bread riots, the women who conformed to the antebellum ideal of womanhood and femininity, right? The young married women whose husbands were soldiers, who behaved themselves in court, got off, while the middle-aged and older women who decided not to conform were often put in prison, usually not for very long. But there is a sort of gendered response to how they behaved. Right? And there's a legislator saying they gave up their right to be considered women when they took to the streets, right? Which really means they gave up their right to be considered ladies who are under protection of men when they took to the streets. Governor Vance told the women rioting that he saw, don't do that, ask for help, right? Petition your government. That's how it's supposed to work in a democracy, right? And they did. He gets floods of letters. And over again, the women writing these letters describe themselves as a soldier's wife or a soldier's widow. Right? And it's not clear how they arrived at this. There's not a political organization suggesting this anywhere. Right? But there's some sort of word of mouth happening where women are claiming soldier's wife as a quasi-political identity. Right? that the state owes me some responsibility because I sent my husband off to fight. Right? I have contributed, I have sacrificed, I have skin in the game too. Right? And you took away my protection and my support, and you now owe me some protection and support in return. And we see this in their letters. We also see it in petitions. Some women have the local elderly men of their community write petitions on their behalf. Say, this woman is a soldier's wife or a soldier's widow. And she's maintaining her farm with the help of her one enslaved man. If you take him away, she will then become a drain on the county and on the community. Right? So it's better for everyone to let her keep doing what she's doing and keep her laborers. Right? So this idea, right, that women who appealed to the government in this sort of appropriate way, right? I'm going to stay in my private sphere and be the homemaker, and I'm asking for you, the government, to take the responsibility of my husband and handle the public sphere. Make sure we have food, right? Because you took away my husband, right? That approach to seeking help gets far more sympathy, as you can imagine, than the riots do. Although I think it's the combination of the two, right, that do get some responses from governments. And as I said last week, we see a bill at in the Confederate legislature to make it easier for counties to buy food for the wives and widows and orphans of soldiers. In Wake County, as much as 20% of the women in the community are getting some form of county assistance by the end of the war. Right? And a lot of that's coming through sort of processes that have been enabled at either the national or the state level. Right? What does resistance look like? Well, clearly rioting is a form of resistance to the Confederacy, right? But so are maybe writing letters of complaint, claiming this new role for yourself, claiming this new role for the government to support individual families that it would never have had. Right? Those aren't necessarily acts of disloyalty. Right? These women aren't saying we want the Confederacy to lose or we want to be part of the Union. Right? So I think it's interesting and challenging but necessary, I think, to kind of parse out the different ways that people are showing loyalty or resistance, right? That demanding bread is not saying, I want you to lose the war. Right? There are women who say, I would prefer the Union won. Right? There are a lot of women who say, I don't want to pick a side, I want nothing to do with this, I just want my life back. Right? There are a lot of religious dissenters in places like North Carolina. Right? So North Carolina's Quaker population. North Carolina's Moravian population. As I said, in Northmore County, there's these Methodist dissenters who are still anti-slavery. In Virginia, there's the Dunkers. In Pennsylvania, if we think of like the Union side, there's also religious dissenters as well. So the Amish and people like that. There's all of these people whose faith tells them swearing loyalty to any government is a problem. Right? There's all these people whose faith tells them you're not supposed to engage in war, period, right, under any circumstances. For the men who are drafted, who are of those faith communities, some choose to accept the draft and be detailed back to their farm to keep doing what they're doing, right, or to take up a role in the medical corps or driving a wagon or manning a prison or something else and say, I'm not actively killing anyone in this role, but I'm also complying with the law, right? Complying with the civil authorities. Other people go to prison to avoid being drafted and say, taking up any role frees someone else to go fire a gun, and therefore I'm going to go to jail instead. And for women, it's the same decision-making process, right? So you'll see some women in these religious communities say, I'm going to go nurse the sick, and I'm going to go visit the prisoners, regardless of what side they're on, because that is an act of my faith. And then there are other women who say, I'll go to prison myself, and some do, in order to avoid having any part of it. So there's sort of individual decision-making process along the way for all of this. Or I'm going to encourage my son to run away, so he's not forced up in this in any way, versus I'm going to encourage him to resist or encourage him to comply to the extent he's allowed. Right? And oftentimes these are very sort of individual decisions, but they can subject women to potential harm, or at least ostracization in their community. Right? Ostracization, is that the word? That if you're in a community that is overwhelmingly pro-Confederacy and you are known to be a dissenter or to harbor deserters, right, you might have trouble getting grain from the mill. You might have trouble with neighbors. You might have neighbors report your husband if he's too old for the draft and he's still at home. Men who were disloyal to the Confederacy were subject to imprisonment and sequestration, which is the government taking your stuff, but specifically for disloyalty. Right? So the government taking your property for disloyalty. And if you're a neighbor who informs on someone who's disloyal, you get a little bounty out of their property as a prize for doing it. So there's an incentive to sort of create this culture of informing on your potentially disloyal neighbors. Right? So is it an act of disloyalty to feed a runaway or a deserter who shows up on your farm? Depends who you ask. For some women, it's just like what you do. A hungry person shows up at your door, and if you have something to help them, you help them. Right? For other people, it's an act of disloyalty, and then there's every potential layer in between there of what it could be. Right? So all of this is sort of just the daily calculus. So the other thing I'm imagining here is like the mental exhaustion that comes with constantly monitoring all this stuff going on around you for years. Right? And so we see that exhaustion and desperation in a lot of the letters where women are really demanding this help. Completely different story, and we're running out. We're just about out of time, so I'm going to skip over that. But I do want to share a few reading suggestions for you if you want to know more about these things. And I want to talk briefly about each of these because I'm not like expecting anyone to go out and read all of these. So Ed Ayers wrote 2 books, In the Presence of Mine Enemies and The Thin Light of Freedom, that are not just about the home front. They're about a county in Pennsylvania and a county in Virginia, which have a lot of commonalities, right, from 1858 through 1873. And all of what the war meant and Reconstruction meant to them, right? So there's home front stories, there's battlefield stories, there's times when those two things combine and collide, when the populations of these two places collide. But it's just about kind of telling all of those intertwining stories. As I said last time, the line between a home front and battlefield is really blurry, and he really gets at that. Judd Browning's book, Shifting Loyalties, is specifically about the Union occupation of Craven and Carteret counties. So it's a very ground level look, and again, it's not just about, and it's about all of the populations who were part of that. So he talks about the experience of being occupied, he talks about the experience of being liberated from the perspective of the enslaved people in those communities. He talks about the experience of being an occupier and what that means to soldiers. Right? But it's all very kind of localized, right? So you can kind of have this mash of everything. Jackie Campbell's book, When Sherman Marched North from the Sea, is about Sherman's campaign through the Carolinas. And it's a short read and a really good sort of ground level look of, again, what it was like to both do that and experience it. Drew Faust's Mothers of Invention, none of these are new books either, but they're good ones. She said she wrote this book because she had heard stories her whole life from her mother and her grandmother of what it was like, or these family tales being handed down of the Confederate home front. And so she wanted to write a book that her mother might actually want to read. So it's all of the scholarship is there, but she's trying to write for a more general audience. So that could be a good one. Favolia Glimpse Out of the House of Bondage really looks at the transformation of relationships between enslaved women and plantation class women as emancipation happens. So it goes kind of before, through, and a little after the war. Alicia Long and Leanne White's Occupied Women is actually a collection of essays, so like each chapter looks at a different place. So if you just wanted to find the North Carolina chapters or something, you could. And Stephanie McCurry's Confederate Reckoning talks a lot more about this idea of the women creating a political identity for themselves and challenging the Confederacy and usually finding it wanting as a protector. So depending on what part of these stories interested you, you could maybe pick out one thing to look at further. So we're rapidly approaching noon, and I promised that I would let you give some suggestions about what we could talk about next week. We could talk about the role that white women play in remembering the Confederacy after the war, okay, and setting perhaps the tone for how the nation remembers the Civil War as a whole. We could talk more about the contraband camps and the enslaved people running away and what it's like for them in various places in the South, and there's a lot of great stories there, great and terrible in equal measure. Last week somebody asked me if I was going to sing, which I've asked my friends who are Civil War historians. It's not a common question. But we could think about like songs that were important to the Confederate home front or that were part of the camp experience. I'm going to make you sing with me, though, if we do that one. But there's other possibilities. We haven't talked about the Union home front at all. It's obviously a very different experience, but there is one. So, thoughts? Preferences? Yes. Yeah, so we could talk about that. We could talk about the aftermath and the returning home experience. Both during and after, because there's a lot of people who come home during the war because they're not able to stay in the Army anymore.
It all sounds good.
Well, we'll sort of set the agenda for next time as well, so. Oh, well, I mean, I'll figure out whatever. All right, well, I will pull something together, but we'll also then maybe know what we're saving for the fall, if I come back. Okay. Yes?
Does losing the war change the idea of the status of women in the Confederacy?
So how does the loss change the idea of the status? I think it's important because so much of what we read that's a primary source is still a memoir. It's an after-the-fact story, so knowing that you lost affects how you think about what you went through. Right? To some extent, and this sort of connects with the question of what happens after, in the aftermath of the war, it's easier for women to resist the Union occupation than it is for men. Right? Women are seen as less of a threat when they do things that men doing them would seem very overtly political and anti-US, and women are just, oh, isn't that cute, right? And so, but sometimes they are taken seriously as a threat. So I think that question of occupation could extend certainly into the post-war period, right, as well, right? Because it's not a direct line. A lot of the soldiers are pulled back and then reinstalled or taken to new places that had not been occupied during the war. But I think the aftermath of both the coming home and what does it mean to be a former Confederate woman now that the Confederacy is gone and you're being surrounded by Union soldiers again are both perhaps interrelated questions that we could look at next week. Sound good? All right. Thank you.
What fascinates me is that we're talking about the great-great-great-grandmothers of some folk in this room. I mean, this is real. And I'm a person, because of so interesting about movements and motions, to wonder, there was the cause. How deep and how long does the consequence run? How does it affect some of you? I was on the winning side. What does it mean to be on the other side? And that's what you're helping us to understand. Thank you for the day, and thank you for the moment.